So I'm Norm Anderson from CGLA Infrastructure, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about the top 100 global strategic infrastructure projects and how we think about those in the context of risk, this being World Risk Day. I'm going to cover a few issues. So the Strategic 100, this is what we call our list. Talk a little bit about the overall objective. Talk about the filters we use to select projects. And then I'm going to talk about how we think about risk. This is, I think, the important part of the presentation for you all. We use something called our country infrastructure capacity rankings in which we survey countries around the world on a regular basis and people who work in those countries about 8 different factors that are critical for infrastructure project development. I'll talk about what those criteria are. Just a second, I clicked through the wrong mouse. I'll talk about what those criteria are. And then I'll also talk about, show you some of the global scores, both 2013 scores and also scores from earlier, 2009, 2010, and 2011. So for comparative purposes, it's pretty interesting, and we'll talk about next steps. One of the things that we do, aside from playing around with our presentations, is every time we develop a list of the top 100 projects, we do 3 of these a year. The top 100 global projects, which is why I was asked to speak here, are the top 100 Latin American projects, which I've just shown you the flyer for that, and the top 100 North American projects. What we're really trying to do is help people prioritize, get a sense of what their priority projects are and the critical projects necessary to make a country or a region more competitive. So we see infrastructure as strategic and unbelievably important. Here's just an overview of what we've done this year in terms of our projects. What we try to do is identify the projects that are critical for opportunity creation and for getting the right people together to execute on those projects. What's relevant, I think, from a risk perspective is that we really do try to pick projects that escape from political gravity, that really are long-term winners for a country. You know, it takes in some countries an average of, like in the U.S., 9.5 years to get a project approved and ready to be shovel-ready, which somebody didn't tell Obama when he was talking about his stimulus. So we use 5 different criteria, and we're really trying to get projects that make a difference for a country. So one of them is it really going to generate significant competitiveness? The second one is it going to generate productivity enhancement or opportunities for productivity enhancement? So competitiveness is a comparison between your country and another competing country. Productivity is increases within your country. How is that project in terms of job creation? Is it a big-time efficient job creator, both directly, indirectly, and in terms of induced jobs over the long term of the project? Because that gives you a sense of whether there's a local constituency for this project. How is it in terms of carbon efficiency? Is it adopting the best environmental methods, et cetera? That's really important. That's important simply to get through the environmental processes. And then another thing we're looking at is, are projects innovative? That's one of the things that we're seeing is more and more important. And one of the ways we measure that is are small and medium-sized enterprises involved in projects. So we use these 5 criteria to identify our projects every year, try to pick the most interesting projects. Here's a monorail project that's being constructed in Sao Paulo right now, fascinating project. What we're trying to do is get people to think that about infrastructure as strategic, and it's absolutely critical to opportunity creation, as critical as education is. So these are 2 issues that are absolutely fundamental for societies going forward. The projects that we had in our top 100 list this year, strategic projects, which is an omnibus category, these are game-changing projects. Then I'm going to run through the second largest category were freight and passenger rail projects. followed by urban mass transit, highways and bridges, ports and logistics, oil and gas pipeline projects, high-speed rail projects in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Brazil, renewable generation, energy generation projects, general electricity generation and transmission projects, water and wastewater, and then a pretty low representation on the airport side. One of the things I'd like to point out to people is not just the overall value of these 100 projects, which was actually $780 billion, but what we do is we try to identify projects that come from what we call infrastructure clusters, where you have a history of successful projects, where you have engineers who are used to working with lawyers, who are used to working with financial guys, who live in a successful public policy environment. That's how we try to identify projects that are going to go forward, projects that we have a lot of confidence in. This year, one of the things that we noticed is that we have projects that aren't dominated by the ports and logistics sector. During the commodity boom, we were really dominated by ports and logistics projects, not this year. So kind of interesting to look at, freight and passenger rail, urban mass transit, highways, bridges, and tunnels. People trying to make cities work better and make cities more livable. In every category except for water and wastewater. Water and wastewater, from our point of view, ever since about the early 90s has become the poor stepchild of infrastructure project investment, and that's an area that we're very interested in improving. We see that as a big risk to countries around the world in terms of public health, infant mortality, and in general, how people think about their countries and how other people think about a country, what its image is. Look at this really quickly. This is sort of an intermission slide, but this is a survey that we did for one of our clients, Aconex, and we finished it in January. So we did it in November, December, and January of this year. We asked people, rank the state of your country's infrastructure, and these are the ranks of people who said our infrastructure. This is the percentage of people who rank their infrastructure as deficient or seriously deficient. And my point here is that infrastructure is a giant issue. The points you all make about projects over budget and over time are absolutely fundamental. And as we look at these figures, we also see that this is an unbelievably important issue for people. The people who did this are infrastructure professionals who responded to our survey. But look at what you have here. You have just people who say it's deficient, their infrastructure in their country, very high. But look at what happens when you add the seriously deficient piece to this. So you've got the U.S., Canada, Brazil, India, Mexico, where we're having our upcoming leadership forum and where they have a new government. Everybody over 70% who say that their infrastructure is deficient or seriously deficient. It's a big issue. And what we found is that that's just a giant issue in every election we've seen. Infrastructure is one of the top issues that people talk about. I mean, it's certainly one of the top three in every election we've seen over the last, let's say, 10 years. It's a big deal. So what we're seeing is that infrastructure, we've been talking about infrastructure as the infrastructure gap and how do you address that in the developing world and the developed world. After about 10 years of calling something a gap that's gradually increasing, you probably should change your terminology, and we're starting to call it an infrastructure crisis, and we think it's a big issue. We think that the model is broken, huge amount of risk that people don't know how to think about between the public and private sectors. They just don't know what their responsibilities are, what their roles are. So one of the things that we do, and one of the things I want to do, inject into this conversation about risk, is what we call our country infrastructure capacity assessment. The CIC methodology came about because none of the ways of thinking about a country's infrastructure made sense from my point of view or from a project developer's point of view. Far from identifying risk, as I say here, macroeconomists, from my point of view, caused even more confusion in terms of how you'd really think about risk. If you think about it from a project developer's point of view, this is somebody who's in a country trying to develop a project and looking at all of the different mechanisms that institutions, people that support what they're trying to do or that don't support them, either in terms of efficiency or in terms of, willingness to be supportive. So the CIC methodology is a complex assessment by infrastructure professionals working in a country of that country's overall capacity to efficiently produce and develop needed projects. We've been doing this for 5 years. We look at both public and private sector capacities. And the important point there was that it's complex assessment by infrastructure professionals. So it's not the public in general. These are infrastructure professionals who really have to be effective in terms of getting their job done and who want to operate efficiently. From a risk point of view, we're identifying issues in the system that need to be fixed. For policymakers, CIC scores identify areas of weakness, including areas of fatal flaws. And for private decision makers, this identification of weakness helps to craft, refine, and deploy strategy and action. So let me show you what I'm talking about quickly. We use 8 different criteria. One of them is, has a country had a serious conversation about what its infrastructure vision is? How does that country plug into the world? What kind of life does that country want to provide to its citizens? Because if you don't have a vision, it's very hard to figure out what your priority projects are, right? Everything becomes a political project. The second point is you really need to have very good public sector technical capacity. People in the public sector who understand the issues, who can produce bidding documents that are defensible and attractive to the private sector. But you also have to have something that's a little more controversial. You have to have public sector, what we call public sector strategic capacity. This means public sector executives who aren't afraid to break eggs to get things done, right? So, there's a country that is full of PhDs from the best universities, and they do very little in infrastructure because they're really not enabled to move things along when they need to move things along. Fourth criteria that we think about are great projects or iconic projects. So one of the ones that we like right now is the Rio to Sao Paulo high-speed rail project, because that really stretches Brazil's public policy requirements, stretches their engineering capabilities, and stretches their financial thinking about how to finance that project. So those are the kinds of projects that we look to see if a country's really good at infrastructure. Does it have those kinds of projects? A fifth category or criteria is leadership, right? So leadership is thinking 3 steps ahead and around the corner. Leadership is, can you avoid a problem before it starts, before a project that just started goes to court, right? That's what you want. You want to see, does that country and does that infrastructure sector have an effective and courageous leader? Another criteria that's very important is, what's the historic project performance in a country? So the projects perform according to the physical and financial requirements, nameplate requirements that we've that they're expected to have. How good is local engineering construction companies? How good is that? How deep is that bench? Very important to get a sense of whether projects are going to go forward. And then local equity capacity. So do local players put skin in the game in projects? Great way to measure that. Another country that we do a lot of work in, we tend to only suggest that our clients get involved in projects in which local pension funds are already involved, right? So local people who've already put their skin in the game. So this is what this looks like. I was sitting in a World Economic Forum meeting a couple of years ago, and they put up a spider graph, and I immediately liked the idea of a spider graph and began to see what I would, from a project developer's perspective, what I saw as critical risk factors, what I really cared about. And these are the 8 criteria that I came up with. And what we do is we ask people to measure each one of these criteria on a scale of 1 to 10, and we tell them that 7 or below is a fatal flaw. If you get a score that's below 7, that's a fatal flaw, right? From an infrastructure perspective, decision maker's perspective, from a developer's perspective, that means you run away from that project. It's a fatal flaw. It's not a near fatal flaw. It's a fatal flaw. You get out of there. So this is Chile, and if you look at Chile, you know, Chile really has some problems. This is a couple years ago in Chile, but they have the highest scores that we've shown. And let me show you. Let me go through some countries very quickly and give you a sense. Chile in 2013 had a score of 44.8 total. 56 would be a passing score. So here's what Chile looks like today in 2013. This is what Chile looked like a couple of years ago. So what you see is that Chile sort of deteriorated pretty dramatically in terms of their infrastructure. And in 2010, it was a 59.3. So they had the only passing score that year. Look at Brazil. Brazil, again, very low scores. They get, this tends to raise a little bit of tension, and consistently low scores. So very hard to go in and develop infrastructure projects efficiently without high transactions costs, to develop infrastructure projects quickly, to develop infrastructure projects on budget. When you have such a weak public sector, and when you have, in fact, questionable long-term project performance issues as well. Brazil in 2010 had much higher scores than they have today. Look at the U.S. scores. This is something that is astonishing. I mean, the U.S., you know, of people who develop projects around the world, when they come to the U.S., they tell me that the U.S. is a developing country in terms of infrastructure projects. Very hard to get that point of view across to U.S. policymakers, but this graph dramatically drives home that point. Vision scores among the lowest we've seen anywhere in the world. So there's not an overall context or consensus for actually developing infrastructure, let alone what kind of infrastructure. Public sector technical capacity, very low. Public sector strategic capacity, these guys are handcuffed, incredibly low. They can't even go to conferences. It's conflict of interest. Great projects, a little bit better. Leadership, very low. So it gives you a sense, and the scores aren't getting any better. They're pretty much the same scores between 2013 and 2011, declining a little bit. Look at India's scores. India, if you look at India, it's fascinating because India's scores are very low, but look at the atrophy on the right-hand side. This is the first time I realized what we had produced here, which is the right-hand hemisphere is all the public sector, right? The left-hand hemisphere in every one of these graphs is the private sector. So India has a pretty robust private sector, but their public sector is incredibly poor. Impossible to develop sustained infrastructure projects if you have that kind of a weak private sector. India's scores have declined dramatically over the last couple of years, similar to Brazil's. Canada's scores are a little bit higher, better scores for the public sector, very low scores on the vision side. But you get a sense when you look at these graphs of the kinds of risks that we see as project developers, and that we wonder why public sectors in countries don't take more seriously, why there isn't a more robust conversation about public sector capacity in countries, and why there isn't a more robust conversation about vision. Here's the UK scores. We'll end, I think, with Mexico's scores, which are where we're going to have our 11th annual Latin American Leadership Forum this coming June. But look at the UK scores. Again, you know, very low scores in terms of what we're really trying to do with infrastructure. I think public sector technical capacity scores are actually too low, but, you know, that probably suggests some dissatisfaction with what you have on the ground. But you get a sense when you look at these sort of very low vision scores, very low leadership scores. This kind of a sandwich is also a big problem and a big red flag. Mexico scores. Mexico 2013, 42. No vision, very low leadership, public sector technical capacity, full of PhDs in the public sector in Mexico, slightly lower scores for strategic capacity. Nowhere does Mexico have anything above a fatal flaw score. Big problem if you're going to try to develop an infrastructure initiative in a country. So if you look at what we have in terms of a summary, every country in 2013 that we surveyed is a real problem in terms of risk among pretty tightly defined categories. And we see that the public sector needs to spend a lot more time figuring out how to address, talk about those issues. Look at the vision scores. This is, for me, fascinating. We compare vision scores from 2011 and 2013. So the bars you're seeing right now, the blue bars are 2011 vision scores. Almost everybody is in fatal flaw territory, just not doing a good enough job. Now, in 2013, everybody is scored incredibly low in terms of their discussions about the vision for their infrastructure. You cannot make good infrastructure decisions, sustain builds, think strategically about infrastructure if you haven't had a conversation in your country about infrastructure projects. Only Mexico seems to have at the very beginning of a new government a conversation about what they want to be doing in terms of infrastructure. Look at the public sector scores. Everything aggregates to a score well below a passing grade. This is the other issue that for the last 30 years we talk about building infrastructure. We talk about what's the right infrastructure paradigm. We talk about the role in increasing private sector investment. But we don't talk about what is a smart or strategic role for the public sector along all the different lines, criteria that we've identified: leadership, iconic projects, private sector, public sector, strategic capacity, public sector, technical capacity, and overall vision. So action items from our point of view. First of all, I'd like to say that I think the initiative in terms of World Risk Day is fantastic, so I'd like to congratulate you all for this. There's probably three things that we'd like to see happen. One of them is we'd like to see a much more robust discussion about how important it is for a country to have a clear vision of what it's trying to do in terms of its infrastructure priorities. Chile is a good example. You know, most countries invest about 1.5% of their GDP in infrastructure a year, of their GDP in infrastructure per year. Chile invested 5 to 6%, just like China, for a sustained period of time, but it was because there was a consensus view across the left and the right about what Chile needed in terms of infrastructure. That's what you have to have, right? I mean, Chile was trying to export high-value goods and services to the world. So all of a sudden, if you're talking about high-quality fruit, high-quality fish, etc., you need very good logistics, good electricity for refrigeration. You need high-quality water. Chile is the only country that we know of that makes the kinds of investments in water and wastewater that you need to make. So that's really important. The second thing to do from our point of view is to have a much more serious, sustained conversation, a renewed conversation about what the public sector's role is. Public sector is starving for resources. So we want to build infrastructure projects. We're in an infrastructure crisis. The public sector has an absolutely fundamental role, and our response is to starve them of resources and not talk about what they need. Huge risk factor is the weakness of the public sector as we try to build projects. And the third one is we'd like to start a conversation with you all about how to think about risk around infrastructure projects in a more holistic way, probably getting people to think about developing this survey in countries around the world, and then taking those ideas seriously. So anyway, thank you so much, and I think that the initiative of World Risk Day is just fantastic, and in the context of infrastructure, it's so important. So thank you.